Are you recording, by the way? Yeah, let's start like that. The actual location is Bonham, Texas. It's for the, of course, for a courthouse. They're restoring. I think the courthouse burns down. I guess we worked on so many like courthouses, so I don't know which one.
This is an interesting courthouse. This is Fannin County, I believe that's the right way, it's in Bonham, Texas. This courthouse, if I'm not, again, might be a year or two. I believe it's a 1936 fire, which is really odd because there are a couple of fires that spontaneously seem to happen in courthouses in that period. Around 36, just it seemed cut a couple of really older courthouses went up. It is an 1880s door, the one that we're working on. It is a Holes, an early Holes, and oddly enough, I've never come across that particular model. In my mind's eye, I've seen one before, but I can't find a reference to that historically, but it was removed out of the courthouse in the 30s. Moved around by several people or went to several locations and then ended up in a barn in Bonham, Texas, next to a barn.
Like in the country, there was a barn outside Bonham. We just brought a trailer actually. Just we carried like vault doors before, but like this was like really heavy, and it was like buried in dirt, so that's why it has a lot of damage on it. So there were like locals there, of course. I remember that there was this big local man, a big guy, like but old, like I'm thinking like over 70 years old, and he was like, and he was so strong that he helped us like. So we picked it up and put it on the trailer, and fixed it and brought it back.
And when we got there, it was literally buried halfway in the mud. It has slumped, for exact. The door was leaning, and the door has actually slumped. It's curved. I had thought at first it might have been in the fire, but the fact that the pewter finials weren't melted means it probably wasn't in the core of the fire.
So with vault doors, it's kind of a specialty here at Van Enter Studios. He's done, oh man, I can't think of how many county courthouses, and each county courthouse has vault doors in it.
I don't know how many doors he fixed all his life.
When you've done over 200 vault doors, well over 200 vault doors, you start to see the individual artisans that worked on which door. There's one guy that you see, he does these funny little squared off acorns and things and little decorations. And that's the same sort of thing you see in Bavarian cuckoo clocks. It's similar to that. So there's definitely a sort of a European flavor to these doors, more Eastern. And those people were coming in large numbers to the United States. And of course they tended to move where the industry was, so which is Ohio and places like that as the West was opening up. There's several key players in the vault door industry. There's Mosler, there's Diebold, Victor, there's McNeil and Urban. There's Holes, of course. There's several iterations of Holes. There's Herring Holes, and you can sort of track them through the beginning of the need for security for documents. And everybody seems to think they are made to keep the bank robbers out, but they're really to keep the documents in. In fact, in a lot of the older documentation, there's a door and a separate door, and they're distance from each other, and they actually interlock very tightly with each other. And the second set of shutters were often referred to as fire shutters. They began a life to be security, but very notably, there's advertising you see after the Great Fire of Chicago, which is 1871. I could be wrong, but I think it's 1871. And at the core of one of the buildings, there's could be a Diebold safe, I can't remember, but there was a safe that had, when they opened it, after everything cooled down and the ashes were all scraped off, they found all the documents perfectly safe inside of that safe. And then it becomes like a blowing out of, as the expansion goes west, and everywhere had the vault doors, the security of keeping the documents in a safe condition. And the very novel idea of having combination locks as opposed to keys that could be picked, locks that could be picked, made them just another level of security. Often they would put little pictures of how big their factories were, and they're usually silk screened or screen printed. And that was to make you feel that you were dealing with a big, safe, established firm. And you see, even with arms manufacturing, you often see pictures of the factory, the Yale Lock and Safe Company, for example. Or the irony is, when I moved my studio from New York, I actually stayed in the bones of the old Yale Lock and Safe. The artist lofts were in the old Yale Lock and Safe Company's building in Stamford, Connecticut. So it's they're now all fancy lofts, but in the late 90s when I was there, it was still a very toxic factory that full of mercury and lead and all the other nasty materials.
Explains a thing or two.
Yeah, everybody makes a vault door, and they're pretty plain with some decorations, and then sort of as each company evolves, the pediments become more ornate, and then they get columns, cast iron, and they become these sets. Often they were set in position, and the buildings were built around them. And you have whole sort of rooms that were considered safe rooms. One of the things that they do is they put plaster of Paris, or plaster, in thick cement. But plaster, what happens is when it heats up to a certain degree, it releases the water in the crystal that has formed the cementatious material, and that steam prevents the materials inside from combusting. It also, there's not enough oxygen because the fitting has to be tight enough, locking together. So these were handmade, so you can't swap one door with another door, one shutter with another shutter. They are made in matching sets. And then the decoration, who's got the better pinstriping, who's got the better art. From the time of the Chicago fire, everybody realizes that documentation needs to be safe. It's not just, it's your title deed, your birth certificate, all those sort of county records. And as the war for who gets the county seat, the courthouses were built with this wonderful competitiveness, and they'd try and outdo each other by having a better courthouse, get the bonds together to make a good courthouse, and then that would be the county seat. So you'd have several towns competing for the county seat as you expanded further into Texas, particularly Texas, Oklahoma, and the South. So the big industry was still in Canton, Ohio, or in the Midwest. They could now use the river systems to punt these things down till you could get them to a railhead. The West expanded. The fights over title deeds. There were, like at San Augustine, the judge's bench has a trap door behind it and an emergency escape. so that if, as it happened several times, there's a lynching or a bombing or some, and you'll see this in some of the courthouses where there's literally grates and steel doors around some of the vaults over the windows for natural light. That's because people tended to pitch bombs, or dynamite was used. But yeah, they would blow up the courthouses and try and kill the judges, and so the vaults were a very integral part. The better your vault looked in the 1880s, the safer that would be, the more money you had, and you would feel safe to have your records in that county. And it was the Wild West back then. As soon as the Comanches and things were chased out with the fort system, settlers worked in, and the county seats, why Texas has, they had to be apparently within a day's ride of the county seat to make the county.
We start the process of like cleaning the layers with solvents, like just one at a time, to see if there's like artwork underneath.
And the steps basically include stripping it down to bare metal and then filling in dents and divots and cracks and stuff with Bondo and sanding it down, making it even, and then priming. The stripping is so gummy, it's almost like resin from a weed pipe. If I'm being honest, but not that I don't know what that is like. It's really gummy. Yes, and dirty, so that's the worst part.
I think my favorite thing is, of course, trying to find out that artwork, if there is any artwork. And when you don't find it, it's kind of like a disappointment.
Not this set of vault doors, but the previous set of vault doors right before this project. There was a door that we stripped the paint off of it, and we could see that there were layers of different levels of paint from however many times the door was restored, and strip off the first layer and you get down to the next layer. And for me, that's really like the part of it that's fun for me, is like getting off the old dirty stuff and then seeing what's under there and be like, oh. And then underneath that, we found a painting that was over 100 years old, that was an original painting that was pretty typical of that time era. Then we had to really be careful and conserve that painting while we're stripping and using harsh chemicals across the rest of the door, and using abrasives and sanding and trying to even out the door. But that was a really awesome process, and finding that painting and then going through and restoring that painting was really fun.
So you also have to keep your eye on the fact that these are mass-produced. Some of the paintings, the little bucolic scenes are very formulaic. You see the Bob Ross effect of the bushes, and there's always a little river and a yacht in the distance, and spare the happy squirrel. We could be looking at those kind of commercial paintings, which are just pleasant. I mean, there's nothing wrong. There's a little bit more of that nostalgia already by the 1880s for the bucolic scene, for the cottage, and there's always a little guy walking along and a broken down fence, and so they are, or if they're not a naval scene. As they became more elaborate, and then the big crashes of the markets in the 1890s, you see this steady simplification, and then by 1910 they're very utilitarian, but still with a certain amount of decoration. But the sort of little bucolic paintings on the front and the naval scenes are all disappearing, and the grotesques and the faces looking down at you, or the lions or whatever, the finial, they start to disappear and change. And then by the 1920s, they're quite utilitarian. And then by the Depression, 29, it's just a steel safety door. It's very simple. In the 1890s, there's a huge economic collapse. People forget that at the end of the Gilded Age, before the turn of the century, there was this huge expansionism, and then the 1929 stock market is really well observed, but we forget that the 1890s had huge, and there had been peaks and valleys, but the 1890s was a huge economic crash, particularly with Western expansion. And I think it has a lot to do with the pre-oil economy. So once you'd bought up all the farmland, and once everybody owned, and there wasn't just another big chunk of land that you could steal from the Indians or whoever, or the Mexicans, and once that land was now all accounted for by counties and things like that, that huge expansionist mentality was gone. And I'm no scholar of that particular economic crash, but you definitely see it. So by the time 1897, or by the end of the 1890s, people were a little bit more thrifty-minded, I think, and you definitely just start to see the disappear. And styles change. I'm also convinced that when a county really wanted to build another courthouse, and they weren't being justified, I think a lot of them were purposely ignited to make sure that the new building went through.
It's gonna be tremendous.
Light your up, eh?
Yeah.
Cocktail, huh?